Welcome to the London Luminaries, 17 properties working together to raise awareness and funds for our collective heritage. My name's Rachel Morrison and I'm the host for this evening. So it is my delight as the host to be able to welcome our chair, the incredible Judith Hawley.
Hello, Rachel. Hello, audience. My name is Judith Hawley and I'm the chair for another in the London Luminaries lecture series. It was lovely to see some of you at our London Luminaries live event, and we're returning now to our online events, and we have a lovely season. We also have a new speaker from one of our new properties. So the London Luminaries is a volunteer organisation which puts together these online talks, provides a platform, and also provides a way for a number of properties in the west of London to share best practice and to support each other. We have regular meetings of the different partner organisations, and it's become a wonderful community. It's a wonderful community with our audience too. And as I mentioned, we had a live event at Pitshanger Manor, and some of you had the opportunity to visit the most wonderful Pitshanger Manor and its great exhibition. And I had the chance to have a chat with some of you afterwards. Now we are introducing a new member of the group, the William Morris Society. Though new to us, the William Morris Society has been running since 1955, and they're located in the basement and coach house of Kelmscott House in Hammersmith. The museum is open on Thursdays, Saturdays and Sundays. And at the end of their talk, I'll plug their current exhibition, which I plan to go along and see myself soon. We've added them to our lovely webpage, so thank you to Robert and Adela and Chris who manage the webpage. And we're updating the trails maps on that page so you can plan to visit in real life and tour a number of properties on one day. So let me introduce our speaker for tonight. She is Helen Ellertson, who's been the Curator of Research and Development at William Morris Society since 2000 and is Senior Curator at the Emery Walker Trust since 2010. Among Helen's publications are A History of the Kelmscott House and Highlights the William Morris Society collection, as well as articles on the arts and crafts movement, including A Feeling for Beauty, May Morris, Emery Walker and the Arts and Crafts of Hammersmith in Country Life. So over to you, Helen. We're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Judith, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you all so much for joining us this evening and for your support. It's such a great pleasure for the William Morris Society to join the London Luminaries as its newest member of this really wonderful group. And it's a great privilege for me to give this presentation this evening, which is going to be a story of love, betrayal, addiction, obsession, and insanity. So our story starts in Victorian London, where the dashingly handsome Pre-Raphaelite poet and painter Dante Gabriel Rossetti attends the theatre, and always on the lookout for what he calls stunners to model for him, he spots a strikingly beautiful young woman in the audience. Jane Burden was just 17 years old and was from a humble background, the daughter of an Oxford stable hand. Jane became Rossetti's model, and it seems that they fell in love when they first met in 1857, but were not to finally be together until 20 years later. The reason for this is that Rossetti was already engaged to marry another working class girl, Lizzie Siddal. Jane, likewise, became William Morris's model, and he also fell in love with her. At this point, Morris was training to become an artist under Rossetti's tutorship and was yet to become the famous designer we know so well today. Jane featured in Morris's very first easel painting, portraying her as La Belle Iseult, as we can see on the left-hand side. The subject matter is from Arthurian legend and uncannily echoes later events in their lives, when Iseult having an adulterous relationship. The reason that this is Morris's first and only oil painting is that it was so heavily criticised at the time. Critics said it didn't do justice to Jane's great beauty. She was standing quite awkwardly and looked quite wooden, and that overall the composition was quite poor. And sadly, Rossetti was one of the first to criticise his own students' work. By this point, Rossetti had nicknamed Morris Topsy, and he had discovered that Morris had tried to practice drawing from a servant girl called Miss Lipscomb, but this wasn't successful. And what Rossetti did quite unkindly was he wrote a poem about the episode and tacked it onto Morris's bedroom door. The rhyme went, "Poor Topsy's gone to sketch Miss Lipscomb, but he can't draw the head and don't know where the hips come." And I think you can see that a little bit in this picture of Jane. It perhaps isn't quite as accomplished as he would have liked, and it doesn't. When we see later on Rossetti's paintings of Jane, you'll see it didn't really quite compare. So you can sort of understand why he gave up. But on the other hand, I think it's an absolutely amazing first attempt. But Morris was so discouraged that he didn't paint again. And he wrote on the back of the canvas, so the part that Jane would see modelling for him, he wrote, "I love you, but I cannot paint you." However, this painting was a eureka moment for Morris, as he finally realised where his true talents actually lay, and that he was naturally talented at pattern designing. If we look at the painting from Iseult's beautiful embroidered dress, the fruiting tapestry in the background, the tablecloth, the bedspread, and the carpet, every inch of fabric is beautifully detailed with glorious patterns. And this would shortly manifest itself in Morris's absolutely stunning designs for wallpaper and fabrics when he was later to form his own company. Strangely enough, despite his own affection for her, Rossetti actually encouraged Jane to accept Morris's hand in marriage when he proposed, and this was perhaps to keep her within his circle. So Jane and Morris were married a year after this painting was started in 1859. And on the right, we have the only known pencil drawing of Jane by Morris, and that was sketched during their engagement. And we know that Jane actually had several copies of this. And as you can see from the note there, she actually gave that out to friends many years later. So it obviously meant a great deal to her. So no members of Morris's family attended that wedding in Oxford. But they moved into their beloved Red House a year later. And this was where their two daughters, Jenny and May, were born, and also where the idea for the firm of Morris, Marshall, Faulkner and Company was formed, later to become Morris and Company, an incredibly successful interior design business, producing wallpapers, all manner of fabrics, stained glass, furniture, basically anything you could want to furnish your home with, in a tasteful, elegant way, with lovely handmade traditional methods in direct opposition to the mass-produced goods being churned out of the factories that Morris so hated. And when Rossetti first saw Red House, he said that it was more of a poem than a house. It was just so beautiful. But of course, he had to have a nickname for it as well, and he called it the Towers of Topsy, after all these lovely sort of Gothic towers in there. And on the top of the weather vane, there's a J and then a W for William and Jane there. They hope to spend many happy years living here at Red House, but it wasn't to be. But I think the 5 years they did spend at Red House were probably the happiest times of their whole marriage. And it's really where the arts and crafts movement was born, because that's where the company started and really started an international arts and crafts movement. And in order to prepare for her new life, Jane had been privately educated, and she recreated herself from the daughter of a stable hand into a lady. However, Jane was far more than just a beautiful face. She was an accomplished embroiderer and an important figure in the management of the embroidery department of Morris and Company, taking an active role in her husband's business and interests. All seemed to be well. However, Rossetti had married Lizzie Siddal a year after Jane married Morris, but Lizzie tragically died in 1862 after just 2 years into her marriage to Rossetti, having had an incredibly sad and short life. There's no time to go into great detail here, but just briefly, Lizzie was the model in numerous Pre-Raphaelite paintings, but arguably her most famous portrayal is Millet's stunning Ophelia, one of the Tate's most popular works. Rossetti was devastated by his young wife's death, which was likely a deliberate overdose of laudanum after she tragically suffered a stillbirth. After this tragedy, there was yet more disruption in the lives of our protagonists. Henry Hall Caine, a close friend of Rossetti's in his last months, disclosed after Rossetti's death that Rossetti had revealed himself as a man who, after engaging himself to one woman in all honour and good faith, had fallen in love with another, and then gone on to marry the first out of a mistaken sense of loyalty and a fear of giving pain. Apparently, he said, "This is the deepest tragedy that can enter into a man's life." And we'll see how this action of Rossetti's would have disastrous consequences. So Jane began to model for Rossetti again in 1865, beginning with these wonderfully atmospheric photographs of her, posed by Rossetti himself in his own garden in Chelsea. And these photographs were used as studies for future compositions of his paintings and marked the real start in their model-artist partnership. Jane was an active participant in the composition of the paintings and the details of them. Although Jane was not considered conventionally beautiful, she was actually the opposite of the Victorian ideal of femininity, of fair hair and petite, whereas Jane was statuesque with dark wavy hair, quite large hands and a large neck, yet she became famous through the Rossetti's Pre-Raphaelite paintings of her, and the Victorian public began to imitate her look and style of artistic dress. Sometime in the late 1860s, Jane and Rossetti began a romantic liaison, and by the early 1870s, their immediate circle became aware of it, and they appear to have started meeting quite openly. Rossetti's letter to Jane of July 1869 clearly confesses his love for her and his views on her husband's love for her, writing, "The more he loves you, the more he knows that you are too lovely and noble not to be loved. And, dear Janie, there are too few things that seem worth expressing as life goes on for one friend to deny another the poor expression of what is most at his heart." Rossetti's letters to Jane at the beginning of 1870 are the most demonstrative of his feelings for her, expressing frustration, love, and worship. He wrote, "I have felt distinctly the clearing away of the chilling numbness that surrounded me in the utter want of you, but it comes too late." In the next letter, he wrote, "No one else seems alive at all to me now, and places that are empty of you are empty of all life." A month later, Rossetti addressed her, "Dearest, kindest Janie, to be with you and wait on you and read to you is absolutely the only happiness I can find or conceive in this world, dearest Janie. But how could Jane and Rossetti be together when she was married to another man? And I think this is where we see Morris at his most sympathetic and magnanimous. In 1871, an agreement was reached whereby Morris shared with Rossetti the tenancy of Kelmscott Manor in Oxfordshire, so that Jane and her daughters could spend the summer in Rossetti's company without overt scandal. It seems to me that Morris put his wife's happiness before his own, as when he went away on 2 long visits to Iceland in 1871 and 73, leaving her alone with Rossetti, he wrote to her, "Please, dear Janie, be well and happy." As can be imagined, this arrangement was not an easy one for Morris. A year after the joint tenancy began, Morris wrote to his female friend, Aglaia Coronio, "I am so glad to have Janie back again. Her company is always pleasant, and she is very kind and good to me. Furthermore, my intercourse with Gabriel," that was Dante Gabriel Rossetti, "my intercourse with Gabriel has been a good deal interrupted, not from any coldness of hers or violence of mine, but from so many untoward things. Another quite selfish business is that Rossetti has set himself down at Kelmscott as if he never meant to go away, and keeps me away from that harbour of refuge, because it really is a farce, our meeting, when we can help it." It appears that Morris remained very fond of his wife, but bitter and hurt towards Rossetti. Morris seems in some stoical way to have accepted the situation, and he and Jane reached an amicable understanding that would last the rest of their lives. I also think it is noble and forgiving of Morris that he later printed one of Rossetti's novels, Hand and Soul, at his own private printing company, and his last great artistic venture, the now legendary Kelmscott Press, based in Hammersmith, whose stunning book started a fine printing revival across the world. Rossetti spent the next 2 summers with Jane at Kelmscott Manor, and he admitted, "All I now find by experience depends primarily on my not being deprived the prospect of the society of the one necessary person." Rossetti's studio walls were covered with drawings of Jane, and she became his obsession. Rossetti often portrayed her as goddesses from classical mythology, where she looks so powerful, and she fills the canvas with her presence. On the left, we have Pandora, a mythological figure from ancient Greek legend, who opens her casket to release the evils of the world. Only hope remains. This work remained with Rossetti until his death. He could never bear to part with it. Rossetti frequently depicted Jane in calamitous marriages, such as Lepia on the right, whose husband imprisoned her, and we see her here playing with her wedding ring, symbol of her unhappy marriage. Mariana on the left is from Shakespeare's Measure for Measure and shows the heroine's isolation and despair. On the right is Proserpine. This story tells of a captured bride, held prisoner, forced to stay in the underworld with her husband for 6 months each year after eating the seeds from the pomegranate, and Jane's own unhappy marriage and the fact that she and Rossetti could only spend half the year together during their idyllic summers at Kelmscott Manor is said to have served as the inspiration for this really beautiful work. Jane adored these paintings, and she kept several, either of the originals or of copies, until her death, many hanging in pride of place at the Morrises' London home, Kelmscott House, named after their country home, Kelmscott Manor. We'll look at some of these pictures shortly, but first, just a very brief introduction to this house. It was actually Rossetti who, house hunting for himself, came across Kelmscott House in Hammersmith. But his main objections to taking the house for himself was the poverty-stricken neighbourhood back then, and the belief that the house was liable to flooding, because actually, as you can see from the photograph on the left, bordering right on the Thames. Around this time, William and Jane were also looking to move from their current house at nearby Turnham Green. But unlike Rossetti, William immediately saw its potential and was eager to allay Jane's fears of taking the house brought about by Rossetti. Fortunately, Jane was persuaded, and the Morrises moved into their riverside home in 1878. And as Judith kindly mentioned at the beginning, the lower floors are now the headquarters and museum of the William Morris Society, and we'd so love to welcome you there, so I do hope you can come and visit. But returning to our story, we have these wonderfully atmospheric photographs of Kelmscott House during the Morrises family occupation. There's a copy of Rossetti's depiction of Jane in Water Willow displayed above Morris's manuscripts on the far left of the drawing room. It was the first wonderfully happy summer together with Jane at Kelmscott Manor that had provided Rossetti with the background for Water Willow, with the manor on the left in the background and the church, St George's Church in the right. And it was one of Jane's favourite paintings. Other rooms of Kelmscott House were likewise adorned with portraits by Rossetti depicting Jane in reverie above the door of the dining room on the far right. And here Rossetti depicts her deep in thought, with her head resting on her hand in this beautifully romantic picture. And Water Willow that we just saw later moved from the drawing room to Jane's own bedroom, seen on the far left of this image. Other paintings in her room included Proserpine above the fireplace, just to the right-hand side there. The summer idylls alone at Kelmscott Manor, though, were not to last, and Rossetti's life was about to take a downward spiral. Rossetti left Kelmscott Manor in 1874, never to return, and there was also another break from Morris when the firm of Morris, Marshall, Faulkner and Company was reconstituted in 1875 as simply Morris & Co. that we know today. The original partners were bought out by Morris, and Rossetti gave his proceeds of the dissolution to Jane. Then Rossetti received a severe attack, critical attack on the morality of a recently published collection of his poetry, which had a disastrous effect on his state of mind, resulting in an attempted suicide and a nervous breakdown from which he never fully recovered. Although he and Jane continued to see each other, the relationship was changed. And very sadly, Rossetti's last years were steeped in drugs and alcohol, as insomnia, depression and anxiety led to damaging use of chloral with whiskey. And Rossetti was haunted by Lizzie's death and the guilt he felt over the later exhumation of her grave. Jane later said that she ended the affair as he was ruining himself with chloral and she could do nothing to prevent it. Although she no longer posed, Jane's features continued to appear in Rossetti's final works, and her concern for him never diminished. She remained a constant presence in his life. He wrote to her that his feelings for her are far deeper than I have entertained towards any living creature at any time of my life. But sadly, Rossetti died aged just 52. However, his monumental paintings of Jane have ensured that artist and model are immortalized. Jane was his inspiration for the last 20 years, inspiring him to produce his most famous works, and together they made artistic history. Rossetti's death must have left an emotional void in Jane's life, and within 3 years of his death, Jane met Wilfred Scawen Blunt, and the following year they became lovers. Devastatingly handsome and incredibly charming, Blunt was a diplomat and a poet. He campaigned for causes such as Irish independence and Egyptian nationalism, as well as introducing the now legendary Arabian horses to England. But Blunt had affairs with dozens of women throughout his long life. Many were wives of friends and even daughters of friends. Despite playing the field for years, Blunt married Lady Anne, granddaughter of the great romantic poet Lord Byron. She remained a steadfast partner until nearly the end of their lives. That was until Blunt brought a live-in mistress into their home, a bridge too far even for the understanding Anne. And Blunt remained impossibly amorous until the end of his life. And his notorious diaries were locked for 50 years after his death, so as not to reveal his numerous secret seductions. Blunt and Jane were exact contemporaries, both born in 1840, and so were in their mid-40s when they met. Blunt's letters to Jane haven't survived, presumably she destroyed them, but his diaries give us a great deal of information on his relationship with her, and additionally, we have much of Jane's correspondence with Blunt, as he retained all of her 145 letters to him. Jane writes how much she enjoyed his poetry, writing, "It is a great pleasure to me to have a glimpse of anything you do in life, and I love the poetry for its own sake. Moreover, it is reawakening in me the old interest in such things which I had long ago thought dead within me. I thank you for all this with all my heart, and shall be ever your affectionate friend, Jane Morris." Jane often writes asking when Blunt will next visit, and in 1888 she wrote, "I value your friendship highly, even more perhaps than you dream of." And a year later, in 1889, Blunt writes in his diaries that Jane had replaced his last romantic conquest in his affections, and that summer was the first time that he became intimate with Jane. He also wrote of the disappointments Morris had suffered, writing, "As a young man, he had married for love, but his wife had never loved him. With his wife, he showed himself uniformly kind, but without tenderness, treating her in a certain offhand way peculiarly his own. She was a lovable and noble woman, but he knew he had never touched her heart. Yet he was observant. What had taken place between her and Rossetti he knew and had forgiven, but he had not forgotten. I used to think too that he suspected me at times, for her intimacy with me was not very explicable, even to the extent of jealousy. More than once, after having left us alone together, I noted that he had returned suddenly on some pretense to the room where we were, blundering with loud footsteps, and as if ashamed of a suspicion which he had not been able to control." It seems difficult to imagine that Morris didn't know of this affair, again conducted in his own home. However, he was just as noble with Blunt as he had been earlier with Rossetti. The Love Lyrics and Songs of Proteus was the third book printed at Morris's Kelmscott Press. And Morris also acquiesced to Blunt's request for special copies to be woven for him of the Morris and Company Adoration of the Magi tapestry and the Primavera tapestry. Despite seducing his wife, Blunt actually greatly admired Morris, saying, "He is a wonderful man." Jane also collaborated with Blunt artistically. His Invenculus is a poetic response to his imprisonment for his role in the anti-eviction meetings in Galway in Ireland. The book cover was designed by Jane and features a scrolling design of shamrocks, a symbol of Ireland. Blunt very much saw himself as Rossetti's successor, even repeating the ménage à trois at Kelmscott Manor. But he notes in his diary how difficult it was to be alone at Kelmscott Manor, with all the rooms opening into each other and many overlooked by the garden. The uncarpeted floors creaked, and every movement was heard in the house. Blunt wrote, "To me, such midnight perils have always been attractive. Rossetti seemed a constant presence there, for it was there that he and Janie had their time of love some 14 years before, and I came to identify myself with him as his admirer and successor." Jane told Blunt that she had never quite given herself to Rossetti as I do now. This has led some people to believe that the liaison between Jane and Rossetti was more of a courtly love affair. Although it's hard to believe now with our modern day values, this is entirely possible, as Morris and the Pre-Raphaelites held great store by the idea of courtly love, with its emphasis on nobility and chivalry. Whereas it does seem more certain that Jane and Blunt's relationship was a physical one, particularly as Blunt noted that she sometimes left a pansy on the floor of his room as a sign she wanted his company that night. Blunt goes on to write in his diaries, "We have very little in common. She is so silent a woman that except through the physical senses, we never could have become intimate. The result in any case is a very excellent and worthy friendship, unbroken by a single unkind or impatient word." Jane confided in Blunt that she had corresponded with Rossetti before her marriage, but he had never made love to her, and she destroyed many of his early correspondence, but still had 10 years of very beautiful love letters. To prevent Morris or her children from seeing these love letters, Jane had actually thought about building them into the wall at Kelmscott Manor. But in the event, she left Rossetti's love letters to Blunt for safekeeping in 1892, as she said, "There is nobody now living who knows me as you do." Blunt called these letters treasures of inestimable value. However, Jane took them back from Blunt in 1909. And after Jane's death, her letters from Rossetti were given to the British Museum with the restriction that they should not be open for public inspection until 50 years after Jane's death. This restriction expired in 1964, and they were finally published in 1976, 100 years after the affair. However, the 114 love letters that Rossetti wrote to Jane do not establish the precise nature of their relationship, but they do show how fascinated Rossetti was with Jane and how in love with her he was. The tone of all Rossetti's letters to Jane are affectionate and demonstrate an almost obsessive concern over her health. The end of the embargo on the letters really makes it clear that there was a conspiracy of silence during and after their lifetimes. The biographers of all our protagonists steered discreetly away from the subject. Jane nursed Morris during his final illness, and he died aged 62 in his bedroom at Kelmscott House, his London home for the last 18 years of his life. Morris was just 62 when he died and had achieved a remarkable amount in those years. He was a poet, author, designer, lecturer, environmentalist, founder of the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, and of course established Morris & Co., one of the most successful design firms of all time. And one of the doctors who attended Morris on his deathbed said that he had really done the work of 10 men and had simply died of being William Morris. And then 2 days after Morris's death, Blunt visited Jane at Kelmscott House to comfort her, and Jane then admitted to him, "I am not unhappy," she said, "though it is a terrible thing, for I have been with him since I first knew anything. I was 18 when I married, but I never loved him." Although Jane did confess that if she was young again, she would make the same decision all over. And I suppose we can hardly blame her. She probably would have remained in a life of poverty if she hadn't married the wealthy Morris. And here we see her portrayed by Evelyn de Morgan. Grey hairs are appearing, and at her foot is a dying rose, and she looks sorrowfully at the hourglass with the sands of time swiftly running out, symbol of her impending death. However, Jane remained a strikingly beautiful woman and continued to be admired. Blunt didn't attend Morris's funeral, believing that no one wanted him there. And despite being a notorious philanderer, Blunt remained a great support to Jane even after the ending of their affair. Jane and May, her eldest daughter, stayed with Blunt on his Egyptian estate shortly after Morris's death, and Blunt seems to have been able to give Jane the affection and emotional support that perhaps Morris was not quite able to provide. Their friendship lasted 3 decades and continued until Jane's death in 1914. Most of Jane's obituaries revolve around 2 things: the accomplishments of her husband and her beauty. The Times reported, "All the world knows the masses of dark hair, the ivory complexion and exquisite features, the beautiful hands and the great grey eyes, which were so unique and so overwhelming in their beauty." Jane and Morris are buried together in the family grave at Kelmscott, in the tomb designed by their great friend Philip Webb. Ultimately, they remained together in life as they are in death. And as we reach the end, I'd like to show this image of William Morris's bedroom at Kelmscott Manor and a close-up of the painting hanging to the right of his bed. I think it's quite telling that Morris chose this image. Firstly, that he chose a picture by Rossetti to hang in his room, and also that he selected this one out of the countless portrayals of his wife by Rossetti, that this is the one he placed in his bedroom, the most intimate of spaces. It shows a 17-year-old Jane Burden before she was chivalrously rescued from poverty and obscurity by Morris and catapulted into the world of the Pre-Raphaelites, before her now legendary love affairs, and prior to her becoming one of the most famous femme fatales in art history. I think this perfectly demonstrates that regardless of the turbulence surrounding their marriage, William and Jane remained endearingly affectionate towards one another. I believe that Morris's self-sacrifice, courageous spirit, and eagerness to put his wife's happiness above his own was responsible for making theirs a truly caring relationship, full of compassion and empathy, that ultimately survived everything and grew into a close and loving friendship. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much for that absolutely amazing talk. I mean, what a story. As you say, a lot of it had been hidden for a long time.